Hi, this is Dr. Victoria Nalule, and today I actually want to talk about the concept of energy progression. I already talked about it before during the various conferences I've been attending and seminars, but today it will be the first time I'm talking about the concept after the publication of our new book, which is Energy Transitions and the Future of the African Energy Sector, Law, Policy, Governance. So I was the main editor for this book, but however, there are several book contributors, including, let me just go them briefly. We have several book contributors from different countries. So for the first chapter of the book, it's about how to respond to energy transitions in Africa and introducing the energy progression dialogue. And this first chapter was authored by myself. So this is the first chapter of the book, because one of the key things that the book does is to introduce the energy progression dialogue. So the first chapter basically introduces the concept of energy progression. So I note it's a new concept. It hasn't been used by any other, let's say, authors, scholars. So this is a new concept that I introduced myself. And then the second chapter, it's about African energy challenges in the transition era. And this is authored by MacDonald. And the third chapter, it's about energy transitions in Africa, context, barriers, and strategies. And this was written by Ms. Noreen Kidondoho. And then the fourth chapter, it's about nuclear energy in the energy transition era. And this was authored by Ms. Susan Nakanwaji. And then that's part one of the book. Now, part two of the book starts with chapter 5, which looks at the role of law in the energy transitions in Africa, specifically looking at the case studies of Nigeria with respect to electricity laws and off-grid renewable energy development. And this chapter was authored by 3 people, including Mike Okpono, Yusuf Sulaiman, and Kester Oyimbo. Then the 6th chapter is really an interesting one because it looks into the status and future of charcoal in the energy transition era. So this chapter basically elaborates more on the continued use of biomass, including charcoal firewood, in this energy transition era. And it basically gives us a clear view of what is happening on the ground in African countries. So in this energy transition era where everyone is saying we have to shift from dirty fuels to renewables, the chapter 6 shows us what is really on the ground. And it was authored by Catherine Nabukalo and Professor Reto Giere. Then the 7th chapter, it talks about renewable energy and energy security in Nigeria, and it was authored by Cosmos Nwendu. And then the 8th chapter is focused on renewable energy developments in Egypt and the initiatives to transition to a low carbon economy. And this one was authored by Dr. Mustafa. And the 9th chapter, it talks about transition to a low carbon economy and renewable energy developments in Uganda, specifically opportunities and challenges for small scale renewable energy. And this one was authored by Marvin Tumsini. Then we have part 3 of the book, which starts with a chapter on local content policies in the energy transition era. And this was authored by Dr. Rokonge Mohongo. And then chapter 11 talks about social license to operate, which was authored by Warim Karanja and Ms. Nduta Njega. And then chapter 12 talks about gender justice in the energy transition era. And then this was authored by Ms. Alaka Lugonzo and Mr. Kenneth Chenge. And then chapter 13 talks about the fiscal regimes in Uganda's upstream projects. And this one was authored by Mr. Ayebare Rukondo Tom. And then chapter 14, we talk about energy transitions and environmental protection, specifically with the case study of South Sudan. And this was authored by Mr. Peter Reid. And chapter 15 talks about powering energy dreams through regional cooperation. And this was authored by Mr. Jafet Karayuki. So the book ends with chapter 16 that talks about extractives and beyond, managing the energy transitions in Africa. And this was authored by Dr. Victoria Nalule. It was authored by me. So that's it about our book. It's called Energy Transitions and the Future of the African Energy Sector. It was published by Palgrave. So if you want a copy, get a copy. But in today's discussion, I want to focus on chapter 1 of this book, because it's the first chapter, actually it's the first literature to introduce the concept of energy progression. And today I just want to briefly talk about the concept. Why am I advocating for the concept of energy progression? Because I know many scholars will cite other concepts that are already there in existence, including energy justice, a just transition to a low carbon economy, issues of energy access. All those concepts will be cited by various scholars who would want to refer to my work. But in this short video, I just want to summarize the concept of energy progression. And to do this, I would like to just share with you something. Yeah, so this is just a summary of the concept. So introducing the novel energy progression concept. So basically, we know there are various discussions with respect to transitioning to a low carbon economy in both the developed countries and the developing countries. But however, with all the initiatives going on, we notice that the poor countries that do not stand their ground with the current developments that are targeting or that are intended to tackle climate change, and also to ensure that all countries transition to a low carbon economy. With all these initiatives going on or various projects going on, we might find that poor countries might become poorer due to their move to transition to a low carbon economy. And why am I saying that? We know there are various initiatives to ensure that we tackle that challenge of energy poverty. I note that my first book, actually, the first book I ever wrote, which was inspired by my PhD thesis, I was talking about energy poverty and energy access challenges in sub-Saharan Africa. And one of the things I note in that book is there have been various initiatives to tackle the issue of energy poverty or energy access. However, the challenge keeps escalating. We notice that more and more people are living without access to clean energy. More and more people are living without access to electricity. More and more people are living in countries where their hospitals lack basic electricity. And for the countries in the global south, we're moving towards industrialization, urbanization. The population growth is estimated to increase. With all these developments that are likely to take place in the global south, that means that our countries will need more energy to ensure that we progressively embrace the population growth, the urbanization we're expecting, the industrialization. Now, I'll also take this opportunity to note that when we're talking about energy poverty, most people think it's an issue of the developing countries. But however, recent data shows that issues of fuel poverty are very rampant in developed countries like the UK. and other EU countries. Because with energy access, you have to note the issue of accessibility. Do the people have access to clean energy or modern energy? In the developed countries, that is a tick. Yes, they do. Reliability, is it reliable? In most developing countries, no, it's not reliable. And also the issue of accessibility, we are still struggling. And then the other thing is the issue of affordability. How affordable is it? So for the developed countries like the UK, you find that the issue of affordability, it's very rampant, whereby poor households cannot actually be able to pay for the energy bills. Even if they're paying, you notice that they spend most of their budget paying for the energy bills. So that makes the issue of affordability really a very interesting issue and an important issue for the poor households in the developed countries. But I'm not here to talk about developed countries because I feel, of course, they are developed. They have already utilized all the energy resources, including fossil fuels, coal, to develop themselves, to go into industrialization, urbanization. So I think for the developed countries, they should really focus on leaving the fossil fuels. But now on the part of the developing countries in the global south, you notice that we are still struggling. We're still struggling. For a country which has like 80% of the population lacking electricity, for a country which still has hospitals that do not have electricity, for a country which has schools that are not equipped with modern energy, then the topic is different. The challenges are different, you know? So what is wrong with the current global focus on energy transitions? What is happening is we have paid a lot of attention to tackle climate change, which is really a good thing, because we should all ensure that we respect the 2015 Paris Agreement. We have to tackle climate change. But however, in tackling climate change, we have to ensure that the poor countries, especially in the global south, shouldn't become poorer due to energy transition initiatives. And we have seen lots of debates, lots of initiatives, especially in the developed world, where they're cutting down funding for fossil fuels, which is understandable for them because climate change is a very big issue that we all need to tackle. But we have to question ourselves, if this funding or finances for fossil fuel projects, if the finances are cut down, that means it's going to equally affect the developing countries, especially countries that are counting on their fossil fuels for economic development. Because I know not every country not every country is endowed with fossil fuels, but for those that are endowed with fossil fuels, they're likely to be negatively impacted if this funding is cut down. Because in my book, in my chapter 1, it's very elaborative. It gives the various examples of countries and financial institutions that are actually cutting down funding for fossil fuel projects. And now, my question would be, now most scholars were focused on the issue of energy justice, were focused on issues of a just transition to a low carbon economy. But the question is, how many scholars or how many experts in this field have actually come up to stand and say, if we're to talk about energy justice, then the first thing we have to tackle is the problem of energy poverty. Because in this book, I actually ask a question: what is justice? How just is it that we still have over 600 million people in sub-Saharan Africa lacking access to electricity? So what are we talking about when we're talking about justice? Because it shouldn't only stop on coming up with concepts and explaining these concepts, it shouldn't just be theoretical, but we have to see the practical initiatives. Because if we're talking about justice, then we should see that there are more initiatives to ensure that the developing countries can actually benefit from all the energy resources they have, including fossil fuels, because that is what they call justice. Now, with energy progression, we notice the progressive nature of energy use. It doesn't just happen suddenly. Countries, communities, and humans generally, we progress from one stage to another. Europe or the developed countries are a very good example of this concept of energy progression. Because you notice that centuries back, they were mostly relying on biomass. Then they progressed to coal. And from coal, they progressed to oil and gas. And now they're progressing to renewables. But in all these stages of progressing from one energy use to another, you notice that at every stage, they had to have available finances, technology, and also the support at the national level, regional level, but also on the ground for the local communities to be able to progress from charcoal use, maybe to coal, from coal to oil, and now from oil to renewables. But that didn't happen in a decade. It didn't happen in a few years. It took centuries and centuries to progress from charcoal use to now renewables or clean energy. Now, I know most people will always, most experts actually, they send me emails, oh, Victoria, the Stone Age era did not end because of lack of stones. And then I'm like, you are being mistaken, because if you're talking about the Stone Age era, and maybe you're in a developed country, you think some people are no longer in that Stone Age era, you should go back to your villages, to the villages in developing countries, and you see how these people are living. The use of charcoal, it's an issue of the Stone Age era for some people in Europe. But now you go in the villages, that is what they're using, firewood, you see. So energy progression, we have to ensure that no one is left behind. And why is it important? Because I know most countries will be now, like Uganda, we have oil, we discovered our oil, and the country is preparing to actually benefit from the oil resources. Namibia, they're preparing to do the same thing. Other African countries that have the resources are preparing to utilize them. But however, we have to note that the global move is likely to affect us. The initiatives at the international level, because I see even the various activists who are putting pressure on the World Bank, on other financial institutions to cut down funding for fossil fuels. So if these initiatives go through, that means that even for the countries like Uganda that really wants to utilize all the resources it has to ensure that the poor people can be able to develop themselves economically, it will be affected. So that is why we need to understand the problem from the ground. Let's understand what is happening. So basically, with the issue of energy progression, we noticed the gap on energy transition initiatives, because I know there are already various initiatives to see that the developing countries are not left behind, like the Green Climate Change Fund, but this is little money compared to the problems we're facing. So if a country has the resources, a poor country, I'm not talking about developed countries, if a poor country has the resources, then they should be able to utilize those resources to fight poverty, because you notice that in most of our countries in the global south, many people are relying on less than $1 a day. So they have to make sure that they fight poverty. We have to make sure that everyone in our country also has access to basic electricity, to modern energy. We have to make sure that everyone progresses in a way that suits them. So with energy progression, the key thing is not to put pressure on the developing countries that still want to utilize their fossil fuels. They shouldn't be put on pressure to leave the fossil fuels in the ground. The other thing with energy progression, the international community, including the UN, the World Bank, they should put more, or they should support more initiatives that are tackling the challenge of energy poverty. Let us be on a same level. We need a level playing field whereby we know at least developing countries have tackled the issue of energy poverty, so we can now move to other issues. But this business of having a few groups of people trying to initiate things that are likely to benefit them, and then not caring about the people who are dying in hospitals due to lack of electricity, that is not acceptable. It has to end, and poor countries that still want to utilize their resources really need to stand up for themselves. Now, in my book chapter here, I still notice that many countries have invested in renewables, which is a good thing. So no one is a climate change denier. Actually, also in the book, I talk about the issue of investing more in clean technologies, such as carbon capture, as a way of tackling climate change. But then in my first book on energy access, I referred to some field work I did on the ground, because when you're talking about renewables, most people forget about the gaps we're failing to fill with respect to renewables. I'll give an example. I was in Tanzania. I was working with the East African Community Secretariat when I was doing my PhD. And I was asked to go on the ground there was a renewable energy company. I don't want to mention the name here, but it was a solar company. It operates in Tanzania, but it also operates in other East African countries. But then when I went to do my research on the ground, because I went to their company, they showed me how they were dealing with different people, how they were tackling the issue of energy poverty and energy access by ensuring that the people in villages are connected. But now there's one thing that we always miss out, especially policymakers in developing countries, in African countries now, is the fact that we're going to fail to totally tackle the challenge of energy poverty because we'll never have effective accessibility and reliability when it comes to solar energy. I'll give this example of this big company. I don't want to mention the name, but obviously if you want to contact me to find out more, you can read my book or I can give you the research. They had this initiative of ensuring that the poor people can actually have access to solar energy. So they had a payment method. They used to pay in installments, but then I think they had to pay like in 3 installments. So the company will go to the villages, they give them the solar panels, they connect them, they do everything, and then they sign a contract that maybe you have to pay for everything within, let's say 6 months or a year, but then you pay in installments. But if a family fails to pay the last installment on time, the company basically goes and takes all its equipment, all the solar panels and everything. So you notice that these poor people who fail to pay on time, they end up still struggling with the issue of energy poverty. So that is the gap we are missing when it comes to renewables and the various renewable energy companies that are operating in different African countries. Do we know how they're treating the people, the terms of payments and everything. Because at the end of the day, we'll feel like we're tackling the challenge of energy poverty, energy access. But if at the end of the day, these people in villages fail to fully pay for the solar panel and everything, and the equipments are taken away, maybe after 6 months. So what problem have we solved? So all these issues need to be considered and thought about before we jump onto the bandwagon of saying goodbye to fossil fuels. So that's just one example. I will write more about some of the gaps, policy gaps we're missing out with respect to supervising the various renewable energy projects in Africa. But in this short video, I wanted to highlight the main reasons as to why I'm advocating for the energy progression concept. The first reason is for the poor countries that are struggling with energy poverty, they need to ensure that they utilize all the resources, including fossil fuels, renewables, to tackle the challenge. Now with energy transition, you notice that most scholars are focused on just transition into a low-carbon economy without giving these people a chance to actually utilize their fossil fuels. So with energy progression, we recognize that poor countries that have the resources and want to utilize the resources, they should be given a chance to progress from biomass to fossil fuels while they're embracing renewables. The second thing with respect to energy progression is advocating for finances to be made available for poor countries that still want to utilize their fossil fuels to be able to utilize them. Because with energy transitions, we're already seeing the pressure from activists, climate change activists, shaming different companies that still want to invest in these resources, shaming different financial institutions. But with energy progression, there is no shame. We recognize that many people are dying in hospitals, many people are still poor. If they have the resources, let them utilize the resources. And the finances should be made available for poor countries. For these rich countries, you can stop financing these projects. I mean, I think they have already benefited enough. Then the third thing with respect to energy progression is recognizing the role of clean technology. So on the part of governments, energy progression, we advocate for governments to emphasize more on clean technologies such as carbon capture, because we know these are very expensive technologies. It's not something that is really cheap, but we emphasize that governments and also companies should embrace more clean technology so that we ensure that we still protect the environment. And then the other thing with energy progression is emphasizing the key role of SDG 7, that is energy access, in the achievement of all the other SDGs. Still on this issue, I wrote more about it in my book, but you notice that we have to ensure that, because there's no way developing countries can achieve all these UN Sustainable Development Goals if 80% of the people lack electricity. So how are you going to eradicate poverty? That is goal 1 of the UN SDGs, when the people have no access to modern energy. How are we going to ensure gender equality when most of our women are just there in the villages collecting firewood for cooking? How are we going to ensure health living when most of our hospitals lack electricity? How are we going to ensure economic development when we don't have even the energy to take us through this economic development? So with energy progression, we're emphasizing the major role of SDG 7 in achieving all the other UN SDGs. And in this respect, we should do all we can. Developing countries should utilize both the fossil fuels and renewables to ensure that they achieve all the other UN SDGs. Another important thing before I leave is the issue of a resource curse, because I know most scholars will quote the resource curse and be like, there are countries that have had the resources for a very long time, but still their people are poor. So this is for the part of the government. We have to ensure good governance and transparency to ensure, to be able to say that the finances, the revenues from fossil fuels can actually help us develop ourselves. But most importantly, the revenues from fossil fuels can be used or can be invested in other renewable energy projects. So revenues from fossil fuels can actually help countries to transition to a low carbon economy. So with energy progression, let us not shame any country, poor country, that still wishes to utilize their fossil fuels to develop their people. The message for the international community is do not cut funding for fossil fuels and for poor countries. The message for the governments is to clearly supervise the projects that are going on in Africa. Are the companies, are these solar companies and wind companies, are they really tackling the problem of energy access? Or is it like in this example of this company I've given you that operates in Tanzania and other East African countries, whereby if these poor people pay for the solar equipment for 6 months and then they fail to pay the entire amount, maybe at the end of the year, then the equipments are taken away and they're taken back to the companies. So we might jump into this bandwagon, but we have to make sure that we find solutions that are going to tackle the problem, permanent solutions, not temporary solutions whereby at the end of the day, it's about business, you know? So if a company comes and says, we're going to tackle the problem, but then after 6 months, after 1 year or even 2 years, the problem still persists, people are going back to zero, then that means like African countries and other poor countries in the global south will be tackling the problem for centuries and centuries when we're not shifting. Let us learn from what the developed countries did. They utilized all their resources. Now they can easily say we are leaving some resources in the ground because they have already gone through industrialization. They have already gone through urbanization, you know? We are not on the same level. We need to progress from charcoal and biomass to clean energy. And that progression cannot happen if the initiatives to ensure that poor countries benefit or progress from charcoal to electricity are being disrupted due to the global move to transition to a low carbon economy. So in conclusion, no one is a climate change denier. We need to tackle climate change. We need to transition to a low carbon economy, but poor countries should not become poorer because of the global move to transition to a low carbon economy. Energy poverty shouldn't be accepted in the 21st century. Poverty generally shouldn't be accepted anywhere. So let us take it step by step. Let us see that we have permanent solutions, not just these companies that are going to give us the equipment for 6 months and then afterwards they take them away because the poor people can't pay for the entire equipment. Let us be genuine and accept that countries face different challenges. Countries and regions, they need to progress at a different, like the process of progressing is different for each country, and we're at different stages. So whereas for the developed countries, their poor people are not using firewood to cook. For the developing countries, we have over 70% of our population that are still relying on biomass. So let us think about them and ensure that we progress. Let us not get into this pressure of, I always call it the streetlight effect. The streetlight effect is where there was a drunkard who lost his keys. He lost the keys somewhere in the dark, but when he was looking for the keys, he was just only looking at where the light was. And they kept asking him, why are you looking for your keys? And the street lights is like, because that is where the light is. But the keys were actually in a different place, which was a little bit dark. So the streetlight effect in research and in this energy transition era is that everyone is talking about energy transitions, everyone is talking about climate change. So we all want to be in the streetlight of climate change and energy transitions. But let us look in the corner, in that darkness. That is where the problems are of energy poverty, of people dying every day in hospitals without access to electricity, of our women spending a lot of time fetching firewood. All the problems are in that dark corner. Let us leave the street lights and face the actual problems. So that was it for energy progression. I introduced the concept for the first time in this book, so do not forget to get yourself a copy of our book on energy transitions and the future of the African energy sector. And we shall keep writing, we shall keep inspiring, we shall keep looking in the dark corners to get the keys and not just to be in the street light where everyone is seeing you. So that's it from me. Have a lovely Sunday. It's actually a Sunday. And it also happens to be my birthday. So happy birthday to me and take care. Bye-bye.